Good morning, everyone. If you'd please take your seats. My name is Michael Waddell. I am the director of the Master of Autism Studies program at St. Mary's College, and it is a great pleasure for me to be here with all of you today for our session on extending radical hospitality. And of course, the theme that runs through all of our papers is disability. We have three excellent speakers this morning. Our manner of proceeding will be for each speaker to make her or his presentation, and then we will do questions at the end altogether. I will, however, introduce each speaker individually. So our first speaker is Sarah Chan. Sarah is a PhD student in philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on the metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical issues surrounding marginalization, and in particular, disability. She'll be speaking to us this morning on the topic of cognitive disability and lives worth living.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for coming, everybody. So the title of this panel is actually Extending Radical Hospitality. But what I hope to do today is, in fact, to show why the thesis that I will present, namely that the cognitively disabled do live lives worth living, is actually not so radical after all. Let me check, because my slides first page is also this, and I am not sure if it's showing. Great. Okay, so even where the secular world recognizes human dignity, it's often suspicious of the human dignity of the cognitively disabled. Within contemporary philosophy, for instance, references to the cognitively disabled occur most frequently as examples of lives that are less or even not worth living. Since prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, for example, has become possible, up to 90% of pregnancies where the fetus has been determined to have the condition have been terminated. Some even believe that not to do so would be to harm the baby. This rather extreme picture stands in sharp contrast both to self-reports from people who actually have Down syndrome, who consistently report a generally high level of satisfaction of their lives, but also to the Catholic vision of all human lives as intrinsically worth living. As a philosopher, although I recognize that the faith tradition offers us rich grounds for the dignity and the value of lives, what I'm going to do is offer an account of how the lives of the cognitively disabled need not be inherently lesser or less worth living, while appealing only to principles that are amenable to secular philosophy. So part one of this talk is concerned with setting up the success criteria. That is, what conditions we need to meet in order to say that flourishing with cognitive disability is possible. Part two is that we'll then focus on Down syndrome as a case study and discuss how flourishing with it is entirely compatible, at least according to all three of the main philosophical theories of well-being. Great. Okay, so let's begin. How should we determine whether a particular trait allows or detracts from well-being? The thing is that actual well-being tends to be very much affected by various contingent features of the environment. As a result, theorists who are interested in a particular trait tend to prefer to discuss it according to how it affects the capacity for well-being instead. The idea is to capture all the possibilities for flourishing with that trait, and if the trait limits the possibilities for flourishing, it's concluded that the trait negatively affects well-being. So it should not take much imagination to see how such a framework stacks the deck against proponents of disabled flourishing in general. Many disabilities clearly do limit opportunities for flourishing. For example, blindness prevents one from enjoying visual art. Being deaf precludes one from orally experiencing music. This doesn't mean that full disabled flourishing is impossible on such an account. So Elizabeth Barnes, famous disability theorist, has notably argued that there may be goods unique to disability, in addition to the losses incurred, such that overall disability is not bad for well-being and can be non-instrumentally valued for its own sake. In other words, there are goods unique to disability that compensate for its limitations. Call this the compensation account. So the compensation account is not premised on the idea that disability gives you special abilities, like better hearing if you're blind, or even special experiences, like deaf people's experience of music via vibrations. Not all disabilities seem to obviously have such special experiences or unique experiences. Instead, compensatory goods also include things like being part of the disabled community, which is more widely applicable to all those with disabilities. As a result, the compensation account is made more plausible. One might wonder, however, if even this is enough to compensate for the negative effects of disability. Goods such as being part of the disabled community may be applicable to all with disability, but ultimately it seems that the things that make this experience good, such as solidarity and friendship, are goods that are multiply realizable by being part of other communities as well. In which case, you might think, it's better to be part of some other community and obtain those goods that way, like being part of the Shakespeare lovers community or the music lovers community. And then you can enjoy the goods of solidarity and friendship without incurring the costs that disability does. Okay, so of course, the mere fact that the framework based on capacities and compensation is less than friendly to the plausibility of disabled flourishing does not itself show that the framework is misguided. It could simply be true that disability tends to negatively affect flourishing. Nevertheless, what I propose is a shift away from the compensation framework, because there's a more fundamental issue with it. And this issue is, it doesn't seem reflective of actual testimony from disabled people about how they have been able to flourish with their disability. Okay, so if you look up at the slides, you'll see an account about Ben Matlin, who's the author of Miracle Boy Grows Up, and an individual with spinal muscular atrophy. He's never been able to walk or stand, and for the last decade, he's been unable to use his hands. Nevertheless, Matlin describes himself as being someone who's gotten pretty much everything he's wanted in life: a degree from Harvard, a wife he loves deeply, 2 daughters, and a successful career as freelance writer, editor, and NPR correspondent. Yes, there's a lot of things that Matlin can't do because of his disability. But for many of them, it's simply the case that he has no particular desire to do them. He's been able to get what he really wants: a fulfilling career, an engaging intellectual life, and a loving family, all without needing to do things like walk. So the thing to notice about this is there's nothing unique to disability about Matlin's writing career or family relationships. Meaningful occupations and loving relationships are goods that are accessible to non-disabled lives as well. The compensation account, therefore, is ill-suited to explain why his life is going well. So instead, what I propose is that we should understand flourishing with a disability in terms of the possibility of achieving a saturation of goods. The idea goes something like this. A blind person can live as well as a sighted one, not because she develops better hearing, she may not, but just because the senses and abilities that she does have are more than adequate to allow her to live as fully and richly as possible. So this approach strikes me, at least, as a better reflection of disability-positive testimony. Such testimony may pick out particular experiences unique to disability, but more often, what it does is simply affirm the ability of disabled people to lead full and flourishing lives by highlighting how they are able to access a variety of meaningful goods that are also those that tend to make a non-disabled life good. On this account, the costs of disability are not necessarily compensated for, but those who are disabled still flourish fully because they have access to a range of valuable goods that allow for what I call a saturation of goods. So at this point, you might be wondering, but how is it possible to reach a saturation of goods if some bads are not compensated for? So we can consider an analogy here. Suppose there are two restaurants. Restaurant A serves 30 dishes, 10 of which are vegetarian. Restaurant B serves 10 dishes, all of which are vegetarian. The food at both restaurants is of similar quality, and each person can eat a maximum of 2 dishes before becoming full. Objectively, Restaurant B has fewer options. But to the vegetarian, it's no harm to go to Restaurant B rather than A. His experience of Restaurant B is just as saturated with good as his experience of Restaurant A. The additional options that A offers are not options he desires anyway. So to the vegetarian, restaurants A and B are merely different. And just as the restaurant goer is limited in the number of dishes he can consume by his appetite, so are finite human lives also limited in the amount of goods they may have. As a result, even if disability does preclude some options, this is not itself a harm, unless one is particularly committed to those options. What matters is that the remaining options are just as valuable, and as long as you can live just as good a life within the available options, we can conclude that the life is saturated with good. So if disability does indeed create additional disability-unique options, that's just so much the better. But we don't need that in order to conclude that disability is compatible with full flourishing. Okay, so that was part 1. Now that we have set up saturation rather than compensation as the success criteria, let's turn to part 2, flourishing with a cognitive disability. As I said at the start, I'm going to focus on Down syndrome. And specifically, we're just going to consider this case on the slides. So Daniel is a 25-year-old adult man with Down syndrome, living with his parents who are his main caretakers. The family is comfortably well off, and caring for Daniel does not cause them particular financial strain. Daniel has moderate cognitive impairments. That means he'll never be able to live independently. He has a marked love for music. He enjoys listening to Mozart. He has close family relationships and is friendly with the neighbors. He reports being happy and satisfied with his life. Okay. This case was constructed by drawing on anecdotal evidence, but also from empirical evidence from a survey of over 200 people with Down syndrome. It's slightly optimistic, maybe, but it's not anything particularly far-fetched. The next task is to show how Daniel can live a full and flourishing life. And I will now proceed by discussing this case study from the perspectives of the 3 main philosophical theories of well-being. So the first 2 theories, hedonism and the desire satisfaction view, are actually fairly amenable to the idea that the cognitively disabled can live good lives. So hedonism just holds that how good one's life is consists in the overall balance of pleasure and pain. So Daniel's feeling happy and satisfied with his life on this account is good evidence that he is flourishing, on a hedonic account, at least. Next, desire satisfaction type views hold that well-being comprises how well one's desires are satisfied. That is, when the state of the world matches what one desires. Depending on the desires in question, it seems that Down syndrome might or might not affect well-being one way or another, so it seems Daniel could well flourish on a desire satisfaction view as well. The last of the 3 main theories of well-being, however, is generally perceived as being less than friendly to flourishing with a disability and flourishing with a cognitive disability in particular. So this is the objectiveless view. The objectiveless view holds that there are a plurality of things that are objectively good, things that add to the goodness of your life, regardless of whether you want them. So these things are like freedom, happiness, knowledge, health, friendship, virtue, all the good stuff. And the issue is, although there are many objective goods available to Daniel, such as loving relationships, one might worry that Down syndrome precludes certain objective goods like autonomy and moral agency, and moreover, that these goods are especially valuable. One might think that it is impossible for Down syndrome to allow for true saturation of goods, because the goods available to those with the condition are not as valuable as those available to someone without the condition. To return to the restaurant analogy, it would be as if one restaurant just had better food than the other. One strategy that the advocate of flourishing with Down syndrome might employ is to argue that cognitive impairment is associated not just with the loss of goods, but also with the loss of bads. The idea is, if Down syndrome does indeed preclude Daniel from moral agency, it also precludes him from moral evil. If you think about all the great atrocities committed throughout human history, you might notice none of them have been brought about by the intellectually impaired. Okay, so this response is somewhat unsatisfactory. In order for it to work, the value of avoiding the bads must be comparable to the value of obtaining the goods. And this doesn't seem very plausible. This is because we typically think of autonomy and moral agency as good independently of whether you choose well or choose poorly. Autonomy is even sometimes thought of as that which causes certain options to be valuable or more valuable. That is, it's good to achieve something, but it's even better to achieve something that you want to achieve, that you chose to achieve. So on this line of thought, if Daniel lacks autonomy, he does not simply lack an objective good. All the other goods that are available to him are in a way infected because they lack the added dimension of value that is due to being autonomously chosen. So I'm not sure how one might argue that autonomy and moral agency are not actually so valuable, that they would not lower one's capacity for well-being. Luckily, however, I don't think we need to do so. I think a better strategy instead is to work to explain how Down syndrome does not actually preclude these goods. In what follows, I will suggest how we might do so by drawing on resources from psychology, from virtue ethics, and from care ethics. So let's start with psychology. As a matter of fact, the idea that the cognitively impaired have moral agency is not particularly controversial in psychology. Within moral psychology, there are two main models for moral development, and although one does focus on rational judgments and moral decision-making, the other is more concerned with empathy and what people actually do in situations when confronted with others in distress. In other words, psychology provides us with an alternative model of moral agency based on the capacity for emotions such as empathy, guilt, remorse. And the idea is that these emotions can serve as moral reasons. And so coupled together with pro-social or antisocial behavior, we get moral action. The idea that emotions can serve as moral reasons is key to the virtue ethical tradition dating back to Aristotle. Even outside Aristotelian circles, it's also been gaining some traction in feminist care ethics. But even if the concept of agency is broadened to include emotions alongside rational reasons, however, most philosophers generally still accept that some cognitive capacity is still required, because the morally relevant emotions must have some kind of cognitive core. Fortunately for the proponent of flourishing with Down syndrome, however, impaired cognitive capacities do not imply no cognitive capacities. And the capacities that they do have may well be sufficient for moral agency. Okay, next consider autonomy. Autonomy has slightly different meanings in different fields, but in general, it always involves the idea of self-governance. To be autonomous is to choose for oneself in response to reasons and values that are one's own. Daniel and others with Down syndrome do require help in obtaining information about what choices are available, as well as in determining what each choice would result in. This dependence on others might seem somewhat at odds with autonomy conceived of as being independent and reasons originating in oneself. What I would say to this is that complete independence from external influence is a myth. As Annette Beyer points out, persons and their values are formed by those around them, especially those who brought them up. Even the cognitively normal access information within a network of others. For example, how did you guys discover where this conference center was? Someone told you, probably, or you looked it up. You looked it up on the internet. You looked up with technology that was uploaded by other people. So autonomy actually is often a collaborative affair. and the difference between those with Down syndrome and the cognitively normal with respect to dependence on others is one of degree rather than one of kind. Of course, there's a risk that caregivers may simply make decisions for those with Down syndrome rather than allow them to make decisions for themselves. But that is a contingent feature of impatient reality and does not mean that those with Down syndrome are incapable of autonomy themselves. Okay, so one last point. Granted, the autonomy of those with Down syndrome is more dependent on external sources than is typical. But this is no reason to think it's not valuable. Holding that only a certain amount of external influence may be involved in valuable autonomy is not viable, because even among the cognitively normal, the amount of external influence that is acceptable seems to shift according to the situation. So, for example, it seems acceptable for a boss to rely on his secretary in order to remember his work appointments. It seems less acceptable for him to rely on his secretary to remember his wife's birthday. So one other option, alternatively, one might allow that the amount of external influence that is permissible for valuable autonomy is precisely the level that normal people typically have in that kind of situation. But that just seems arbitrary and very ableist. The last option is to argue that even if there's no threshold of independence, it becomes less valuable as dependence on external sources increases. But this is contrary to how autonomy is normally conceived. We do not normally think that highly intelligent people have more valuable autonomy than average people. So I think that we can conclude that it is entirely possible to flourish with Down syndrome, even on the objectiveless view of well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Father Lambert Niamey. Father Lambert was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He received a doctorate in philosophy, specializing in metaphysics and ethics, from the Catholic University of Congo and the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. He then earned another doctorate in theology, specializing in environmental ethics and bioethics at the Catholic University of Leuven, also in Belgium. Father Niamey will be speaking to us this morning on disability, embodiment, and human dignity.
So disability, embodiment, and human dignity. Human beings is ontologically a being in the world. As Martin Heidegger underlined it. Sorry, I'm going trouble with my... Is that work? Can you... Okay, thank you. That is technology. Disability, embodiment, and human dignity. So the human being is ontologically a being in the world, as Martin Heidegger underlined it. We are embodied beings. So we act in the world by the meaning of our body, and the body is an absolute condition of my existence, a common denominator of existence. Even God knows that in order to get in contact with human beings, he needs to have a body. That is why he became man. The mystery of incarnation affirms the relevance of the body. However, even though the body is so important in our lives to be in the world, the body has been demanded since the time of old. So, if we have that negative view of the body in general, so how much more a body with disabilities? A person with disabilities raises question regarding the cause of disability. I like that even in the Bible, when the disciples met with someone with disability, they asked Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or this parent, that he should have been born blind? So the response of Jesus is so interesting. Neither he nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. So this response of Jesus showed us that disability and embodiment is a fertile field for theological and philosophical reflections about human dignity. That's what I want to study here. I will examine the way Jesus faces disability and also the ethical implication of his action. So, two questions guide the discussion. Is disability a punishment from God? Is human dignity ontologically different for people if they live with disabilities? I will try to do it in 3 steps. The first one, disability in the Bible. And then Jesus faces disability, and I will conclude with the ethical implication of Jesus' action towards people with disabilities. Disability in the Bible. Disability is a reason for exclusion, discrimination, prejudice, inequality between human beings, even in the Bible. In the Old Testament, no access to the temple and its surrounding of people considered unclean, disabled, and sick. People who are disabled, blind, disfigured, or deformed cannot approach the altar to offer the food burns for Yahweh. So it means that being disabled was an obstacle to be a priest. Physical disability involves imperfection of the body. Therefore, this imperfection is an obstacle to the exercise of the priestly office. Disability is therefore understood as a punishment from God, a punishment for sin and disobedience to God's commandments. Even in the Old Testament used blindness to describe people who dwell in the darkness of prison or captivity of sins. Hearing impairment is a symbol of spiritual stubbornness. And then, even in the New Testament, disability is still understood as a punishment from God. in the New Testament, we have in the New Testament addresses the issue of disability in many ways. The two blind men in Matthew, the blind and dumb demoniac man cured by Jesus in Matthew, the cure of a blind man in Bethsaida in Mark, Bartimaeus, the blind man on the road to Jericho. We also have the cure of a man who was born blind in John, the healing of the deaf man in Mark, the story of a paralyzed servant of the centurion in Matthew, the healing of a dumb demoniac in Matthew, the healing of a paralytic man lowered through the roof in Mark. I like that one. It's well known. So we have all those stories in the gospel to see how disability was so central in the ministry of our Lord Jesus Christ. And according to Nancy Heisland, 3 theological themes have created obstacles for people with disabilities. The first created confusion between disability and sin. I grew up in Africa, in the DRC. In my tradition, people used to believe in a kind of reincarnation for people with disabilities. It means that if someone is born with disability, that man or that lady, in his previous life, he was living without disabilities, but he was using his body to do wrong. That's why, to punish him, God will send him back in the world with disabilities so that he can repent. So disability is still considered as a punishment from God in many, many cultures. Even here, sometimes I heard people come to me saying, Father, what wrong did I do for God to treat me like this? Disability, that's confusion as a sin. The second understands disability as a virtuous suffering. So we have nothing to do. Let's suffer like our Lord Jesus Christ, and enjoy life of suffering. The third view views people with disability as a curses of charity. And here also, instead of helping them, people living with disability, give them power of autonomy. But what we do, we keep them in that context and helping them, showing how charitable we are towards them. So, those themes together, that's what Iceland calls disabling theology. It does not consider people with disabilities to be worthy of humanity. That was so inconsistent with Jesus' health ministry. So let's see what happened with Jesus faces disability. Besides the exclusion in the Old Testament, we also find some references that include people with disabilities in God's plans of salvation. We can see the prophecy of Isaiah talking about the liberation of people of Israel. That day, the deaf will hear the words of the book, and delivered from shadow and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. And he continues. The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unsealed. Then the lamb will leap like a deep, and the tongue of the dumb sing for joy. So Jesus came to fulfill this prophecy. So it means that The sick and the people with disabilities are the focus of the healing ministry of Jesus on earth. Jesus made it clear at the beginning of his mission. When John the Baptist was in the prison, he sent his disciples to Jesus, asking him if he is the Messiah, that's who should come in the world, or we have to wait for another one. And Jesus said, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind see again, and the lame walk. Those suffering from virulent illnesses are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised to life, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." So Jesus breaks down social, cultural, and religious barriers towards people with disabilities. So he stands for an inclusive community, and in that community, each member created in the image and likeness of God is endowed with dignity. So what are then the ethical implications of Jesus' actions toward people with disabilities? Reaffirmation of the ontological human dignity. Every human being, born or unborn, has value by the mere fact of being created as a human. Even in the mother womb, we are not fully developed. However, we are fully human. Therefore, our dignity must be respected from conception to natural death, and in each stage of our life on earth. Our dignity is a requirement that something is due to the human being simply because he is human. The disabled person is one of us and participates fully in the same humanity that we possess, said John Paul II. We are all equal partners within the human community. There is no reason to distort the image of God in the people with disabilities because their bodies or minds do not conform to what the society has defined as normal. Hence, the promise of resurrection, the transformation of our mortal bodies includes the bodies with disabilities. This transformation is related to the incarnation as a mystery giving value to our embodied nature. As I said at the beginning, God became flesh so that he can easily get in contact with us as human beings, because without body, a human being cannot be in the world. However, even though the body is so necessary to be in the world, but the body has been diminished since the time of old. There is in the history of humanity a very negative understanding of the body. So it is evident in the dualism philosophy of Plato. The body is a place of passion and illusion, the prison house of the soul. So for Plato, in his dualism philosophy, what matters is the world of ideas, but the material world is only an illusion. So the body being material is an illusion, the prison of soul. The Middle Age is not an exception because Christianity exalted the purity of the soul over sinfulness of the body. So the body is a corrupted dimension of man, the veil of tears, a highway leading to damnation and death. So But that dualism of Greek philosophy took another turn in modern time. So the dualism is not anymore between the world of ideas and the material worlds, but it is now between the gap between the res cogitans and the res extensa, the subjects and the objects. The body is devalued in favor of the thought, what Descartes said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What matter is the thinking, not my material body. But even still there is a tendency to devalue the body in favor of the soul, uniquely called to salvation. Even today, in our church, many people think that we need to deal with the body for eternal life, to deal with the soul for eternal life, nothing to do with our body. So the question, is the body such a drag that it makes man existentially worthless? Is the body itself the major cause leading up to his existential worthlessness? I think so, because the body seems to be the cause of his worthlessness, because our body appears sometimes in the mode of having body objects. I have my body. Sometimes in the mode of being body subjects. So human beings cannot be without his body, but his body is ambiguous. It is both the body that he has and the body that he is. He lives without ever losing his home. Or the body is one thing, but a thing where I live. It is on the side of the subject, but is no stranger to the worlds of things. So, thus our conception of the body impacts the way we deal with disability and human dignity. I think so. Why? With the conception of body objects, the body is objectified. It is an instrument, an object of manipulation like any kind of tool. It must function well to produce the appropriate results. For example, I have my pen here. I use this pen to write. And if the pen is not writing anymore, what I will do with that? I will throw it away because it's become useless. That's what also happened with our body objects. The dysfunction of one of the limb or organs is an issue. And this is not only for people living with disabilities, even the elderly. As their body does not function anymore like it used to function before, so their body objects become useless, so we have nothing to do with them. That's a question, our human dignity. So it raises stigmatization, discrimination, and exclusion of people with disabilities. The body objects is a poor image of our body. It does not value our ontological dignity. I am not me and my body. I am my body, the body subject. So with the conception of body subjects, people with disabilities do not lose their dignity, even though their bodies do not function well. In conclusion, disability is not a punishment from God. It is a way of being in the world. Disability affects neither the humanity of a person nor his essence, his ontological dignity as a human being. So considering the context we are living now, the context of pandemic, many people lost their job. Many people, especially those living with disabilities, are suffering from discrimination. I would like to conclude with the beautiful words of Pope St. John Paul II. It will be radically unworthy of man and a deny of our common humanity to admit to the life of the community and thus admit to work only those who are fully functional. I underline fully functional. To do so would be to practice a serious form of discrimination, that of the strong and healthy against the weak and sick. Work in the objective sense should be subordinated in this circumstance too to the dignity of man, to the subject of work, and not to economic advantage. This is an invitation to move from the body object to the body subject for the sake of our human dignity. Thank you for listening.
Was it just me, or did we get like an illumination of the Holy Spirit there? Okay, that was just me. Our last speaker is Thomas Williams. Tom teaches philosophy at St. John's University, Rome campus, having also taught for many years at the Regina Apostolorum Pontifical Athenaeum and the University of St. Thomas. He was a visiting research fellow at the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture in the fall of 2018. He's worked as a consultant and a commentator on faith, ethics, and religion for several television networks, including NBC, CBS, and Sky News in the UK. He was appointed by the Holy See as a spokesman for the Synod of Bishops in 1997 and again in 2001. He's published over 5,000 articles. Is that right? I don't think I've published 5,000 definite articles, let alone 5,000. Sorry. Williams' 17 books include Who is My Neighbor?, Personalism and the Foundations of Human Rights, and The World as It Could Be, Catholic Social Thought for a New Generation. Professor Williams will be talking to us today about dignity and disability.
Good, it's working. I'm very honored to be a part of this very illustrious panel. It's as if we had called each other prior to the presentation, because even though we're speaking basically on the same topic, our three presentations are very different. In particular, I think they are compatible in very surprising ways. So I'm very, very pleased to be a part of this. I'd like to begin my own thoughts with a recent anecdotal situation which took place at the beginning of September of this year. And it coincided with and was caused by the Supreme Court's decision not to block the Texas heartbeat law. This is not going to be a political discussion, and I don't care what you think about the jurisprudence involved in that particular case. What I care about are the issues and the debate that happened right afterward. The day after this, on September 2nd, on Twitter, social media network, trending was the very obvious hashtag abortion. But right below abortion was trending Down syndrome, which is perhaps surprising. And I followed some of the debate that was happening. And there was a particular figure named Richard Hananiah, who is a writer with Newsweek, who had a series of tweets about the dangers of the heartbeat law, specifically in terms of Down syndrome. So Hananiah tweeted out on, as you can see, September 2nd, you can't screen for Down syndrome before about 10 weeks. And something like 80% of Down syndrome fetuses are aborted. If red states ban abortion, we could see a world where they have 5 times as many children with Down syndrome and similar numbers for other disabilities. Could be outliers in the whole developed world. There are already negative stereotypes of Americans in these states. One can imagine it getting much more extreme. What if they also ban genetic engineering and embryo selection, while other places go ahead? Will they maintain their belief in a small safety net and lower government spending in such a world? Would liberals change their minds about government spending if it ends up going to the states that have much higher costs due to these laws? Many interesting things to think about. Our friend Robbie George from Princeton was not slow to respond to Mr. Hananiah and began with this question: why is Down syndrome trending on Twitter? Because some people are arguing we need permissive abortion laws so we can screen for people with Downs and kill them in utero. So wrong. No member of the human family is inherently superior or inferior to any other in basic dignity. Sometimes it's worth remembering that what became known as the Holocaust did not begin with the murder of Jews or Slavs or Romani. It began with the killing of the disabled and cognitively impaired. They were regarded as useless eaters and declared unwertes Leben, life not worthy of living. The ideology that held Down syndrome people and others to be lives unworthy of life did not originate with the Nazis. However, it predated their rise. Its architects were sophisticated, urbane, progressive people, like legal scholar Carl Binding and medical specialist Alfred Hoch. Claiming that we're eliminating Down syndrome by killing people with Down syndrome, so long as we catch them early enough, is like claiming that we are eliminating poverty by killing poor people. It is barbaric, and the very thought of it should fill us with revulsion. This highlights the single point that I want to make in this talk, which is there in society today, and especially in debates around the topic of disability, two radically incompatible understandings of human dignity, which is the topic of our conference these days. And I'd like to kind of set them side by side, give you a few examples of them, and what I think are the underlying suppositions about human nature and about who human beings are in the world that are at stake. These two different conceptions of human dignity revolve around the question of human exceptionalism. Human exceptionalism in certain circles has become a dirty word. To talk about human beings as unique, to talk about human beings as different from all the rest of creation, as something that is markedly different and even superior, of another very bad word, and something deserving of a special regard that is not accorded to the rest of creation, is a debate that is very much in the present context that we're living. And there are a number of presuppositions and corollaries that go with these two answers, whether we believe in or do not believe in human exceptionalism. On the first, our understanding of dignity is that it's binary, like a toggle switch. It's on or it's off. Either you have it or you don't. You can't have 75% dignity. You can't have 87% dignity. You either have it or you don't. And dignity, since it is, according to popular understanding, and goes back in a particular way to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is at the root of human rights. Our understanding that rights come because we have rights because we have dignity. For those who reject human exceptionalism, there is a tendency to believe that dignity is differentiated. Since not only humans possess dignity, and animals possess dignity in a different way or in a lesser way, there are also human beings that possess dignity in a higher degree, and those that possess dignity in a lower degree, because it's differentiated and not merely binary. Those who believe in human exceptionalism would say that dignity, the way we understand it, is proper to humans exclusively, whereas those who reject it would say that dignity extends to non-humans, to other beings. On the flip side of that, the universality question, those who believe in human exceptionalism believe that it is of all humans indistinctly. And those who would reject this say not all humans necessarily possess dignity, or certainly not in the same degree. Those who accept the notion of human exceptionalism, believe that dignity is intrinsic to the person. It is something that is inherent, is to be respected, is to be revered. It is not something that is projected or evaluated from the outside. Whereas for those who reject human exceptionalism, dignity is considered extrinsically, as we're about to see in a moment. And finally, this leads to something which is not always articulated in these terms, but it's very much understood as implicit in these two understandings. Those who embrace human exceptionalism would say that humans are necessarily all equal because of that. Simply belonging to the human race makes one have a dignity which is equal to anyone else's. whereas those who accept a more differentiated form of dignity would not agree with this. And again, we're going to see examples. This is not just me talking. I'm going to take two very well-known philosophers to exemplify these two visions of dignity. And the first is Thomas Hobbes, who is everybody's favorite bad guy. Thomas Hobbes wrote very famously in his Leviathan, "The value or worth of a man is, as of all other things, his price. That is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power. And therefore it is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of another. The public worth of a man, which is the value set on him by the commonwealth, is that which men commonly call dignity." And I hate to say this, and we could have a really interesting debate, but Sarah's whole presentation comes from a supposition that this sort of external evaluation of the quality of life is paramount. And while I believe that that's very important for those who begin with that understanding, that major premise, I think it could be contested that even if you couldn't show, as you very ably did show, that many people with disabilities live a very full and fulfilling life, even if they didn't, that wouldn't change the fact that respect is due to them. Because it's based on, in my consideration, a view of dignity which is not the one that comports with a true understanding of human nature. On the flip side of this, if we want to go to Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher writing in 1785, he says basically the opposite thing. In the realm of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. You heard that Hobbes said price and dignity are the same thing. Something that has a price can be exchanged for something else of equal value, whereas that which exceeds all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. So he's counterposing these as, again, incompatible understanding of price and dignity. You either have one or the other, depending on what sort of entity, what sort of being you are. And we all have a similar understanding. Not everyone would embrace this working definition of dignity as an excellence that merits special regard. But I think that basically we understand dignity to be there is something good and even a superior excellent good that in some way generates a series of duties of other people to treat that with a special regard or respect. And in this way, I think it's a fascinating concept, unique in a way because it helps us to leap over the problems of David Hume and G.E. Moore that an ought can never proceed from an is, because it's a concept that kind of rolls them into one. It's the sort of excellence, it's the sort of good that merits a special regard, that commands from others this special regard. I'm going to look through a few examples of the historical development, I'll make this as quick as possible, of this first extrinsic understanding of human dignity, dignity that comes from without, and this differentiated non-binary understanding of humanity. This is kind of at the beginning of it all. This is Charles Darwin writing The Descent of Man, a very, very well-known passage. The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. So we're a little smarter, we're a little better, we're a little more abstract in our thinking. We have seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even sometimes in a well-developed condition in the lower animals. We'll find that many of those who propose this vision of human dignity today are Darwinists of sorts. And Darwinist not only in terms of understanding the historic theory and how it developed of evolution itself, but taking it more as a universal philosophy for understanding the human condition. A great proponent of this is Peter Singer. These are all basically utilitarian philosophers that determine the worth of something by the happiness or the pleasure that it brings on a net. Writing back in 1983, Singer wrote in this very, very telling title of this article, Sanctity of Life or Quality of Life. And he was proposing in this essay that this antiquated idea of sanctity of life be replaced by a much more rich and scientifically honest title of quality of life. Only the fact that the defective infant is a member of the species Homo sapiens leads it to be treated differently from the dog or the pig. Species membership alone, however, is not morally relevant. It was Peter Singer, he didn't coin the expression speciesism, but he made it a term du jour. He made it very, very popular. He really encouraged the debate, and it challenged humans to get beyond their prejudices and discrimination against other species, saying that it was an irrational respect given to members of one's own species. Singer also wrote in that same article, we can no longer base our ethics on the idea that human beings are a special form of creation made in the image of God, singled out from all other animals and alone possessing, I think it was, a mortal soul. Our better understanding of our own nature has bridged the gulf that was once thought to lie between ourselves and other species. So why should we believe that the mere fact that a being is a member of the species Homo sapiens endows its life with some unique, almost infinite value? And finally, from Peter Singer, this is from his book, The Sanctity of Life. During the next 35 years, the traditional view of the sanctity of human life will collapse under pressure from scientific, technological, and demographic developments. By 2040, it may be that only a rump of hardcore, know-nothing religious fundamentalists, like people in this room, will defend the view that every human life from conception to death is sacrosanct. Going on to Richard Dawkins, I promise only one slide on Dawkins, and this is just, of all the things he's written on this topic, this one I thought was particularly telling. In 2014, this is again on Twitter, he responded to a woman who said, I honestly don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome. Real ethical dilemma. And Dawkins responded to her, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. In 2021, earlier this year, he was challenged on this on a radio show, and he responded from his utilitarian ethics. He said, given that the amount of suffering in the world probably does not go down, probably does go up compared to having another child who doesn't have Down syndrome, then that's what I meant. Basically defending his understanding here. Not only do we have this at the philosophical level, we also have it at a level that actually fears and despises what it sees as the human weaknesses present in disability. And this is some very strong language that's going to be coming up now. You might be familiar with it. You're certainly familiar with the figure. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. Listen to what Nietzsche wrote in The Genealogy of Morals. The sick are the great danger of man, not the evil, not the beasts of prey. They who are from the outset botched, oppressed, broken, those are they, the weakest are they, who most undermine, who most undermine who most undermine the life beneath the feet of man, who instill the most dangerous venom and skepticism into our trust in life, in man. Here the worms of revenge and rancor teem all around. Here the air reeks of things unrevealed and unconfessed. Here the web of the most wicked conspiracy is continually being spun. The conspiracy of those who suffer against those who are successful and victorious. Here the sight of the victorious man is hated. It's not surprising that Nietzsche's understanding of this is tied into his view also of religion, and particularly Judaism and Christianity. He writes in the same book, it was the Jews who, rejecting the aristocratic value equation, good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals blessed, ventured with awe-inspiring consistency to bring about a reversal and held it in the teeth of the most unfathomable hatred, saying only those who suffer are good, only the poor, the powerless, and the lowly are good. The suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people, the only ones saved. Salvation is for them alone, whereas you rich, the noble and powerful, you are eternally wicked, cruel, lustful, insatiate, godless, you will also be eternally wretched, cursed, and damned. We know who became heir to this Jewish reevaluation. This Jesus of Nazareth, he continues, as the embodiment of the gospel of love, this Redeemer, bringing salvation and victory to the poor, the sick, and sinners. Was he not the seduction in its most sinister and irresistible form, seduction and the circuitous route to just those very Jewish values and innovative ideals? Having looked at some of these rather ugly concepts, I'd turn quickly to the flip side of this. Thomas Aquinas didn't write a huge amount about human dignity, but when he did, he associated it as being coterminous with personhood, something that whenever you have a person, you have dignity. This sense that it is binary. Where you have person, you also have dignity. And he did it. He's speaking about the Holy Trinity, but then he brings it into personhood in humanity. And he says, for as famous men were represented in comedies and tragedies, the name person was given to signify those who held high dignity. Hence, those who held high rank in the church came to be called persons. Thence, by some, the definition of person is given as hypostasis, distinct by reason of dignity. A hypostasis is a being, a subsistent being, distinct, made, characterized by reason of dignity. And because subsistence in a rational nature is of high dignity, therefore every individual of the rational nature is called a person, Aquinas wrote in Summa. This also ties into our understanding of equality. I think it's significant. I remember the first time I read this years ago when Thomas Jefferson was first writing out the draft of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, we hold these truths to be, I'm forgetting what are the terms. No, but at first he said something in sacrosanct. To be, I can't believe I'm forgetting the first adjective. Something in sacrosanct, and he went, and the copy still exists, where he crossed out sacrosanct and he wrote in self-evident. And the fact of the matter is that as we're seeing more and more, they are no longer self-evident. They're self-evident from a Christian worldview. They are not self-evident from certain secular philosophies, as we're seeing. They are not self-evident at all. You could say that at a time when everyone in the room would nod and say, of course they are, but that's because you're dealing with people of a certain cultural Christianity that no longer can be taken for granted. John Paul II wrote in his Christi Fidelis Laici, this is back in 1981, the dignity of the person constitutes the foundation of the equality of all people among themselves. There can be no equality. You can't speak about men and women being created equal if they do not possess equal dignity. And as soon as you make a distinction between a disabled person and a person who is considered normal, then you open the door to distinctions between you who have an IQ of 160 and someone else who has an IQ of 120 and someone else who has an IQ of 80. The difference there, again, if it's just of degree and not of kind, then their rights will also change as they become more elite, as they become more qualified, as they become more talented. The Catechism of the Catholic Church picks this up as well. Created in the image of the one God and equally endowed. I think it's fascinating that they actually use the term, this 1992, equally endowed with rational souls. All men have the same nature and the same origin. Redeemed by the sacrifice of Christ, all are called to participate in the same divine beatitude. All, therefore, enjoy an equal dignity. The equality of men rests essentially on their dignity as persons and the rights that flow from it. You see, the contrast that exists between these worldviews is almost absolute. They are mutually exclusive and they are incompatible. I'm going to end with a couple lines from a great man, Romano Guardini, who was a German priest, philosopher, and theologian, and one of the most important influences on the theology of Pope Benedict XVI. He cites him often in his memoirs. He speaks about him with great esteem. Actually, Romano Guardini died in 1968, the year that Joseph Ratzinger wrote Introduction to Christianity, kind of his breakout book. And in this, I don't want you to read this yet. Guardini makes a really stunning, I think it's stunning when I read it for the first time, assessment of the situation of disability and poverty and weakness in humanity. And he said that this disability is not only cause for compassion and pity, he says, but in good people, it elicits reverence. He chose a word, which I think is very, very interesting. And so he's writing in this essay, which became part of his book, Learning the Virtues That Lead to God, reverence is awakened in a well-ordered mind by a great person in a noble work, and we can measure the degree of culture of a man by his ability to feel such reverence. But it is strange and an honor to man that this feeling can also be aroused by what is smaller, defenseless, incapable of making its own way. Whereas the low and vulgar man this is jet lag, I apologize. Where the low and vulgar man feels the impulse to exploit the defenselessness of the child or the inexperienced or weak person, the decent man feels impelled to respect the defenseless. Helpfulness, yes, but why reverence? Perhaps it's because the decent man, when confronted by helplessness, is touched by the proximity of destiny and stops, and it is here that the matter takes on a religious meaning. Jesus illustrates the last judgment in St. Matthew's Gospel by saying, whatsoever you do to the least of my brethren, you do it to me. This may, of course, mean simply that Jesus wished to show how low the measure of human action extended, even to the least of my brethren, but that is not how the text reads. Jesus does not appear to be holding up the little ones as a test case to show how far Christian charity must extend, but rather identifies with them directly and specifically. In a way, we could say rather that the principle is universal only insofar as all of us are that little one, the least of his brethren. Thank you.
All right. We have just a minute for one or perhaps two questions. If you would please approach the microphone and speak your question into the microphone, we'll let the panelists respond.
Question for Sarah. On I think the account of flourishing you're developing here, I really like the idea of the term saturation idea you have. It seems to work really, really well for the case of disability. I wonder about how it works in like other cases. So like two theoretical, very, very quick theoretical problems and a practical one. Two theoretical ones are, how does the account deal with situations that make it less likely that you'll reach a certain saturated level without stopping you from doing it? How does it deal with cases that make it harder to do that without stopping you from doing it? And then the sort of practical case is, you know, it seems like very few kinds of concrete harm can actually stop a person from reaching this kind of level. You know, if somebody injures me in some way, it doesn't seem like that's going to stop me from reaching this level of saturation of the good life. How, therefore, are we supposed to account for those kind of things as harms?
Thank you for your question. Okay, so maybe the first thing to say about that is this talk was kind of positioned against the very extreme view developed by some philosophers, notably Jeff McMahon, that disabilities, and also Peter Singer, I guess, that disabilities lower your capacity for well-being. Obviously, we also want to take into account the fact that some things just make it harder or less likely for you to achieve things like saturation. I think whether what you want to discuss possibility or you want to discuss likelihood depends on what context you're speaking in. So if you're talking about something like public policy, maybe like public policy, it's better to take into account things like what is more likely, what makes it harder. And that also links into your second question, which is how do you account for harm? I think you can develop, it makes sense to me. It seems common sense that if you're making it less likely or harder for me to achieve a saturation of goods, I can kind of cash out harm in terms of that. But if you go back to possibility, apart from when you want in particular to argue with particular people like Singer, like McMahon, possibility is important in specific cases of well, like abortion, right? If you're going to be, it's really extreme to say that it's going to harm the baby if you don't abort the baby because the baby has a disability. It's like, well, would people prefer not to live, not to be born, as opposed to being born with a disability? Seems like no.
Thank you for your presentation, Father Niamey. I just wanted to offer a thought. I wonder if your theological presentation would be completed by reference to the fall. Adam divorces himself from the will of God. Immediately, the first thing he sees is that he's naked. He's looking at his body as an object for the first time. Then he's looking at his wife as someone to have lust for instead of love for the first time. And he's divorced from the earth and has to scrabble at the ground with his labor. The resurrection, you have a reversal of all that. Jesus' body is totally integrated with his soul and subject to his will. He eats fish, but he passes through locked doors. And it might be a theological reason why we're always so tempted to see the body as an object instead of that part of our existence by which we are actually encountering the world as part of ourselves. I wondered what you might think of that.
Yes, exactly. And as I said, God became flesh to value our body. Only by becoming flesh does he get in a relationship, in a phenomenological relationship with us as a human being. So, and with the mystery, that's why the mystery of incarnation is related to the mystery of resurrection. Jesus raised from the dead, not only the soul that raised from the dead, but him, the body, and all of him. He raised from the dead. He gave value to our mortal body, but he transformed that to give us a glorified body that can help us to see God face to face. That's why I think that Christianity is a religion of body, where the one who raised from the dead, he raised with his body that he transformed. And we believe that we also, when we consider our body not as an object, but as a subject endowed with dignity, God will transform it one day, and so that we can share in the mystery of resurrection with the same body but transformed, that we will become spiritual so that we can be able to see God face to face. So it is that invitation from the body objects, but it is not through the body subjects. The body subjects involve our ontological dignity.
If I may take just a moment before we break for lunch, I want to take just a moment to remark on how extraordinary this is. I've been a professor for just over 20 years, and 20 years ago at a conference like this, there would have been no junior scholars thinking about disability. 20 years ago, there were very few churchmen talking about disability. And 20 years ago, if there had been a family member revealing how painful it is to have a child or a sibling or loved one denigrated in the way that people with disabilities often are, it probably would have been a mom rather than a dad. So this is quite an extraordinary thing that's happening here. And I wanted to make sure that we thank Carter Sneed and the Center for Ethics and Culture for giving us a space to have this conversation with people who might not always live in this world. And thank all of you for coming and being part of that conversation. Thank you.